Kia ora and welcome to Module 2, NGOs and Other Development Players. My name is Dr. Samantha Leonard and I work with Maria at the Institute of Development Studies. My primary role is to manage the Masters of Sustainable Development Goals, which is a new degree program that we've started in 2020. We have our first cohort of students this year. We've got 30, which is fantastic. Domestic, international, working, people who've just finished degrees. It's fantastic. So just before I carry on, if you are interested in sustainability and thinking about what you want to do once you finished your undergraduate degree, you know who to call. Get hold of me or check out the website for more information. All right. So today we're going to be speaking about NGOs and their role in the development field. I just want to say from the start that this lecture does not replace your notes. If anything, this is just a brief introduction. I'll talk about some of the main concepts, I'll point you in the right direction for where you need to be reading more and spending more time on. But basically, this is just it's an overview to get your mind thinking, to get the juices running. It doesn't replace any of the reading. Okay, the most important thing is that you read through the study guide and you read through all the readings. My aim is that by the end of this short lecture, you will have a good idea of the background information and some key concepts and be able to understand the module guide and the readings better. Right, so here we go. Let's go. NGOs. As you can see from this slide, there are loads of NGOs, okay? All over the place. You will have come across many of them. They're very common in our world today. And if you want something, another bit of an introduction, you can always check out the website at the bottom there. Now, in your module guide, early on, there's a reference to David Korten, who I adore. I think he's fantastic. If you are interested in civil society and the role that grassroots organizations and people at the grassroots level can make, you want to read David Korten. I've got 3 of his books here on the side. His first one was When Corporations Rule the World, Changed My Life. Definitely recommend it. And then he's got 2 other books, among many others, where he talks about how we could have an alternative economic structure, an alternative way of approaching the way in which we do development. At the heart of his ideas or of his philosophy is that he talks a lot about we need a people-centered development, not an economic-centered development. And actually, on this note, it's been so interesting on an international scale to see how different governments have responded. We are very lucky in New Zealand to have a people-centered government to a large degree. They made decisions with people at the center of their decision-making, whereas many other countries, some of the big ones we all know, have chosen economic-centered developments, and they've put economics as their primary concern. So that's just an aside, but something that's interesting and something to think about as we watch this COVID-19 unfold. But from David Korten's perspective, he talks about the fact that if development is really going to improve the standard of living for people, if it's going to improve the way in which people experience their lives, then it has to be people-centered. People have to be at the beginning, at the middle, at the beginning, at the end, and in the middle. What does that mean? It means that for development to really occur, we have to be focusing on improving local communities' self-reliance, being able to do things themselves, being able to make their own decisions, social justice. So key aspect there in terms of justice being, the people's rights and not being exploited. And then participatory decision-making. And we're going to talk a little bit later about the relationship between participatory and empowerment, or participation and empowerment. People-centered development recognizes that economic growth does not inherently contribute to human development. Think about that. Would you agree? Do you disagree? What is the dominant rhetoric that we hear? What is the status quo? The status quo would say that generally in the mainstream media and mainstream thinking, basically economic growth improves everybody's lives. It's a very common philosophy, a very common worldview, a way of understanding the world. David Korten, after his many years in experience, which you must look up because he's fascinating, he recognizes that economic growth is not always directly linked to improved livelihoods for people, particularly people on the, the poorest of the poor or the most vulnerable. And therefore, he says that if we really want to see development happening, we need to look for changes in social, political, and environmental values and practices. It all comes together. What is it with this whole people-centered development? Well, it's based on the idea that if we go take a step back quickly, development, what is the aim of development at the end of the day? There's lots of different definitions for it, for understandings, and I'm sure you have come across this, and you will come across this in the rest of this course. But essentially, development is about improving people's lives, improving our day-to-day lives, making life better, creating sustainable livelihoods. And basically what David Korten is saying, is that the only way that we will really achieve development, in other words, the only way that we will really improve people's livelihoods, is if we are people-centered and we focus on changing in social, political, and environmental arenas. And here's just a great comment that I've also added in, just to try and to spark some interest, because I'd love you to read further on what he has to say, and you really must check out he's got a website, I think it's called Live in Economies. It's fantastic. And this is a great comment, a great quote that I'll leave you with in terms of David Korten, but just to get the juices working in your brains. The great work of humanity at this historic moment, and sorry, just to butt in there, he didn't write this year, but in terms of a historic moment, he was referring to basically the global crisis of 2008, but maybe we're in a historic moment right now with COVID-19. So imagine, let's put it into this context, the great work of humanity at this historic moment where COVID-19 is making us reevaluate and reimagine our lives and the way the world runs. What is our work? Well, it is to negotiate a transition from an era of an empire to an era of community. Economic transformation from a global suicide economy to a planetary system of living economies is an essential centerpiece of this transition. What is he talking about? Well, he's basically you need to read more about what he's saying, but he refers to the current capitalist system of production and consumption across the globe as a suicide economy, because it's through this practice, it's through this global system that we are going to effectively mess up the only planet we can live on. So it's a suicide. And what we have to do is we have to try and rearrange this, change the way things are, and focus on a planetary system, a global system where we focus on what a living economy is. And I really encourage you to look further into what that is. Why do we start with David Korten? Well, because he's got such a focus on people-centered development and development at the grassroots, and looking at participation and self-reliance. It's all the principles and elements of essentially what NGOs hope to achieve. So that's why we start with someone like David Korten to get us thinking about these concepts. And you'll see that as we carry on through this lecture, and as you read through your study guides and all your readings, you will see these constant themes coming up: local communities, local self-reliance, local decision-making, social justice, grassroots justice, participation and in decision-making, human development, links to social, political, and environmental. So basically all these concepts you're going to see coming up in the discussions around NGOs. Right, so what is an NGO? Well, according to the World Bank, NGOs, they're private organizations that they mainly pursue activities to relieve suffering, promote the interests of the poor, protect the environment, provide basic services, or undertake community development. So what does that mean? Well, they've got a meaningful approach. There's some cause that has motivated this NGO to become or to do what it wants to do. NGO is an organization independent from the government, which is quite clear in the non-governmental organization title, and has a humanitarian or cooperative rather than commercial objectives. So it's not about making money, it's about making change. And we're going to come back to that a little bit later, though, in terms of the challenges that are facing NGOs today in terms of being commercially viable, but put that in the back burner. So essentially, Yeah, they're legal organizations, but they operate independently from government and independent from profits or private countries. They're not for profit, and yeah, basically I've said that. It's all about wider social or environmental aims and games. So yeah, organizations that are doing what they're doing for a purpose, for a value higher than economics, which you can straight away see how this links to Corton. What are the functions? Well, lots of functions, okay? They generally have a primary objective. Each NGO will generally be focusing on a specific kind of relief or change or service that they want to provide, whether it's assistance or crisis relief, social health services, education, loads of areas. We'll talk more about this as we go. A lot of NGOs focus on advocacy and awareness regarding particular issues. So advocacy in terms of people having, speaking out for those who cannot speak for themselves. A lot of focus on education and research, human rights, and environmental. Loads of, from the beginning when we looked at that first slide, there's so many NGOs out there. There's lots of activities that they're involved in, but as we said previously, looking at social and environmental type causes. So creating awareness, protecting human rights, trying to promote rehabilitation of people or the environment, gainful employment, combat crises that man and humanity have caused, protecting the environment. This is probably all what you already know. I like this. I think I like things that are a little bit different, and I really like pictures. You'll see that later, but many of you may be familiar with the proverb, give a man a fish and feed him for a day, teach a man to fish and feed him for a lifetime. And NGOs have been quite central in the role of not just giving, but in equipping and empowering. And we all talk a little bit more about that again later when we talk about the challenges facing NGOs. But I quite like this little logo that I found. For me, and you'll see this later as well, I think pictures paint 1,000, pictures say 1,000 words. And whenever I'm reading something and I'm not really sure what it means, or I don't have it worked out in my head, the first thing I do is I Google that concept or that term, and I go to images and I look to see what are the pictures saying, just so that I have a basic understanding, and then the reading becomes clearer. So I like the way that that this little analogy here has used the proverb of give a man a fish, feed him for a day, teach a man to fish, feed him for a lifetime. Where they've the different NGO roles, there's those who give a man a fish, and there are times when when handouts are necessary, specifically when there's a disaster, or when you are assisting the poorest of the poor at the bottom level, where you just have to provide food or shelter, basic needs. So there's the protection role. Teach a man to fish is, now we're looking about, well, now we want to prevent this catastrophe or prevent the current bad situation from carrying on. So we want to equip, we want to empower, we want to help, NGOs want to teach a man to fish so that they can start to take control of their own lives. So prevention, reducing people's vulnerability through income diversification and savings are some examples. Education's a big one here. We'll talk later on about empowerment, participation, decision-making, use of local resources. So preventing the current situation from continuing. Linked to that, we want to promote, and I see now they've taken the proverb and they're using it a little bit further. Now we're going to organize a fisherman's co-op, okay, which is a classic NGO response, and possibly one of the most criticized responses to NGOs, because so often, for many, for a long period of time, the go-to was, well, let's create a co-op, and often they didn't work, particularly in developing countries. But once we've hoped, there's the realm of prevention. Now we look at promoting. How do we increase people's agency? Which, in other words, what we mean is their ability to make decisions for themselves. So how can we enhance this? How can we increase opportunities? How can we make this work better? And then moving on, using the same proverb, protect fishing and fishing rights. Now we're talking about things that happen on an economic level, a political level, transformation, redressing social, political, and economic exclusion or oppression. So just, I think, quite a cute little diagram of the different kind of roles that NGOs play, linked to that proverb about the fish. one of the best response I've ever heard, in fact, to that proverb is from a socio-evangelist or socio-economist, Toli Campolo. And he says, give a man a fish, feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish, feed him for a lifetime. And then he carries on and he says, but only if he has a pond or a lake or a dam. And that aspect, which would fall under transformation in terms of access to resources, and really looking at the way in which resources are shared and used in our world, in our context and in the local context, and who has access to what resources. So I think I would have added that in there. I would have gone, give a man a fish, teach a man a fish, teach a man to fish, and then I probably would have added one in there, give a man access to fish, because access is a key factor. Just a little thing on the side there. All right, so this table is in your notes, and it basically talks about how NGOs have changed over time. And there's a lot of information in here, but essentially the key thing that you're looking at here is that, which links up with this, is that initially NGOs were very focused on protection, providing relief to victims of disaster. And the criticism was, well, okay, so now you've given them a fish, but now what? Now we haven't empowered anyone. We haven't helped anybody to gain control of their own lives. Do local communities now have ownership of their own resources? Do they get to make the decisions about the local resources and how they are used? So essentially what this picture here shows is just some specific examples of this kind of movement from protection to transformation. Basically saying that if you look at the comments on the very right-hand side with fourth, it's transformation. It's transforming the way in which things are done, access to resources, power relationships, agency, advocacy. It's transforming. So if this table here in your notes is a little bit confusing, look at the fishing example and it might help you to understand a little bit better. All right, so for example, I just had a thought now that I should at least give you one example, but chief actors, 1, 2, 3, fourth one down, is a classic example. So back in the early development days, early NGO days, 80s, I suppose, initially, the people who were seen as the most important people in development projects were those doing the development. So it was the NGO or it was the development practitioner, and they were going to go to a community and they were going to show them how to live a better life and what they needed to do to make their lives better, and the NGO had all the answers. And then we had a change in thinking, and people started to say, hang on a second, how can you from the outside know what's going on more than the people who actually live there? And there was a change in the way people understood Indigenous knowledge and respect for Indigenous knowledge. And so we started to see a change where, okay, so now we say, all right, well, development is about NGOs who really have all the answers, working with the community who have some knowledge, but like we'll try and teach them kind of effect, but at least involving the community. I'm being a little bit facetious on the side here. Moving on to more of a sustainable systems type approach, saying, you know what, development is not going to work even if it's just the NGO and the community. We have to have all the stakeholders involved, public, private, because everybody is involved. We've got to get everyone involved. And moving on today, well, to the fourth stage, into where we're looking at it's all about development is now focusing on creating networks between stakeholders to ensure that development projects and initiatives continue. So it's gone from an NGO implementing something, doing development, moved through the stages of, okay, well, let's try and get more people involved to come on board, to a stage where now the focus is on networks of people working together on the same project to make it happen. So you can see how that relates to protection, just an NGO giving food. Prevention, okay, well, we'll work with the people. Promotion, let's get a few others involved. And then actual transformation, okay, let's create actual networks of stakeholders where we're working for the same thing. That's where our greatest level of longevity is. I do realize I'm moving a little bit fast through this. And like I said at the beginning, this is just, it's the framework that the lecture provides. And with this kind of thinking in your mind, go through the readings, go through the study guides, and hopefully it'll make a little bit more sense. All right, moving on to the challenges faced by NGOs. And in each of these slides, you'll see that I've sometimes added an extra, what's it called, web address that I may have found, just for some extra information. Often I'll link it to things that have simplistic understandings. That's not enough for your essays or your assignments, but it's a great starting point in terms of understanding the more complex discussions that you will read in your readings, or especially in the academic readings. Like I said previously, I'm all about simplifying. I think if we can understand the concept in a simple way, then when we read more complicated readings, it makes a lot more sense. So for the next few slides, I'm actually going to be looking at pictures because I love pictures. All right, so just quickly. So the next section we're going to be looking at are the challenges faced by NGOs. Okay, NGO advocacy in one easy lesson. Get article into the Irish Times, complete and utter political and societal change in favor of development. Now, if we were in a classroom, I would then say, okay, what kind of challenges are highlighted in this cartoon? And there's a few, but I suppose the main one is often that I think for many NGOs, their overall aim is too big. Okay, we're not, I mean, are you going to really completely and utterly change political and societal development? So in one sense, maybe the goal is too big. In another sense, the other big challenge illustrated here is, okay, well, how do you get from a simple article to complete and utter change? Like, what are the steps in between? So I think to summarize, I would just say that one of the top challenges faced by NGOs is just the complicated and complex situation in which they have to work, where there are these incredible pressing needs. You know, people see that there is such a need for drastic change, but how do we get there? How does our little contribution get there? A huge challenge to face. I like this one. Another one is there are a lot of NGOs out there. There are a lot of charities. There are a lot of organizations, a lot of people calling for action or change in a whole lot of different areas. So as an NGO, you are competing with a whole lot of other people and organizations who also have fantastic causes and worthy aims and goals that people really should be focusing on. And how do you make a name for yourself in the midst of all of that competition? How do you gain the support that you need? How do you get the volunteers or the funding that you need when you really are competing in a very competitive environment, where we have so many so many important needs on many levels, and excellent people doing excellent things in all those areas? And how do you as an NGO stand up and form your niche within that market? How do you get there? Difficult times. And the thing to remember is often NGOs start off by people who, actually I have a picture on that. Wait, we'll get to that. Okay, you've told me lots about all the problems here, but can you show me an example of how you're actually solving them? Okay, big challenge for NGOs is do they succeed? Do they actually solve problems, or do they just highlight the problems that are there? Okay, it's difficult, especially because often NGOs are working in very complex, very dire situations. It's hard to see the results. It's hard to see the improvement sometimes, and that is difficult. It takes years and years before real change happens in terms of developments with communities. If you're talking about education, or you're talking about true empowerment or decision making, it takes years for things to happen. And in the middle of that, and in that time, it can be quite frustrating, and to think, well, I'm not even getting anywhere. Internally thinking we're not doing anything, we're not achieving what we set out to achieve. But also externally, people look at NGOs and think, well, what have they done? They haven't even done anything. Like, go Greenpeace, but actually the world's still being trashed. So have you even achieved what you set out to achieve? So it's a difficult environment in which to work. This is the key one, the big one. Okay, funding. There are non-profit organizations, very difficult to find the funds that they need. I like this joke on the left here. We're a not-for-profit organization, but we didn't plan it that way. bit of a joke about just not having enough money. And then the picture on the right, the challenge of how money just gets less and less as it moves down the chain. And often NGOs are right at the bottom, who then have like the tiniest bit left to give to those in need. So, and we'll come back to this, always a funding issue. This one here is a great one in terms of administration, and what's the word I'm looking for? A bureaucracy. Thousands of excellent proposals, but not one uses our improved format. And then in the corner there you see the improved format, and it's so complicated. And there's this little person from an NGO who is not equipped in this area and has to try and follow all these different rules and directions and how it all works together. So there's a lot of time spent on writing proposals to donors for funding. So much time, meetings, or trying to fill in all the forms. So on the one side, it's just the bureaucracy of trying to access funding is so difficult and so complicated. And on the other side, there's so many people also wanting that same funding. Funding is actually in short supply, and there's a huge demand for it. How do you stand out? How do you try and access it? Especially smaller NGOs, where they've got these incredibly complex processes they now have to follow before they can even be considered for applying. It takes time, it takes human resources, it takes energy, it takes knowledge. It's a difficult thing. Funding is not always easy to come by. This is another great one. Okay, not the beating children part, but her comment is actually great. Beating children is bad for them and should stop. I don't think that idea will work here, but I don't want to offend them. Something that a lot of NGOs, especially NGOs who are working in different countries and different cultural contexts, is often there's a lack of one of the challenges NGOs have to overcome is, can you be sure that you're really communicating with local communities, that you really understand where they're at, how they're thinking, how their cultures work, what are their social dynamics and how do they work? What are their social systems? Who's really in charge? Who isn't in charge? It's not enough to just have one big group meeting and say your thing and everybody nods and smiles and you think, oh, this is wonderful, when it's not. People are just nodding and smiling, but behind the scenes, you actually have very little idea of the social dynamics that are happening. So for NGOs working in different cultural contexts, there's this challenge of how do we cross the cultural and the social divide? How do we really understand the social dynamics in the community in which we're working? Because if you don't understand those social dynamics, then whatever you try and implement, whatever, it won't work, because you don't understand how things really work. And often people are not quick to talk, and from local communities are not quick to talk. They're not quick to put their hand up and say, oh no, listen, that's not how it works. Often in cultures there's a hierarchy of authority of who can talk when and where, and so they're really, for NGOs, they really have to, and this is something they have got quite good at, or focused on over the last decade or so, is really trying to employ methods that allow for everybody to have a voice and a safe place where people can really talk, so that the real issues and the real social dynamics can come to the fore, which is a better foundation for whatever developmental project or initiative they're working on from there onwards. Just a small one I wanted to add in here is the concept of volunteer tourism. If you're interested in the critique of this, you need to go to the spin-off and look up their article on volunteer tourism. And a lot of the time, NGOs, it's like, let's get the white kids come in and build a school for the black kids who can't do anything. And that's not development. That's not what development is. That's just a show. That's just a holiday trip. So I just put this in there. If this sparks an interest in you, if you react, oh wait, what are you talking about? Or if you feel angry when you see this, then go to the spin-off, I think it's .com, and look up volunteer tourism and see what some of the critiques are about that. In other words, is it a band-aid solution? Are we all just going out there to, feel good about ourselves because we painted a school and then we leave? But we actually haven't done anything, or we haven't actually impacted, or the local people haven't really benefited from our visit. So yeah, lots of critique about that, which is interesting. So with all those challenges that NGOs face, they've still been around for many, many years. And the last section that I want to look at is, just briefly, is the future of NGOs. is there a future for NGOs? And obviously, in terms of answering that question, we need to ask ourselves, well, have they succeeded or failed? And how do we assess this? How do we know? So I just want to look at a few slides now to just highlight a few of the concepts and the kind of thinking and the questions that we need to ask in terms of assessing whether NGOs have succeeded or failed, and therefore, is there a future for them? Are they angels or devils? Are they the solution or are they the problem? And as academics, it's not necessarily about being able to say, oh, they're this or that. It's about understanding both sides of the argument. It doesn't matter which one you agree with, you must be able to understand both sides. Key, participation. How do we assess whether an NGO has succeeded or not? At the end of the day, it comes down to community. Well, at the end of the day, one of the most important aspects that we look at in terms of assessing the success of a development plan or initiative or work of an NGO is the level to which local people participated and were empowered through the process. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as we move through the slides. He won't listen. He keeps wanting to build a well, and I keep telling him this theory of change is flawed. There's a lot of challenges when it comes to participation and working with local people, and NGOs working with local people, especially, like I said before, when you have a cultural divide or a social or economic divide. And just two things that I like that are picked up in this picture is, often what happens in the development world is that the developer or the person who's got the money and the ideas and is coming in to do the development and make the change and change the world will come in with a preconceived idea and will just push ahead with that and not listen to what other people are saying. And when that happens, most of the time development fails, the project or the initiative fails, and people often then blame the community, like, oh, you see, they can't do it. Meanwhile, the community is thinking, whoa, we never even asked for that, we never even wanted that. Like, what do you mean we failed? And so especially in today's day and today's world, where we do know so much about participation and empowerment and true community development and sustainable livelihoods, has an NGO succeeded or failed? Well, if they're pushing their own agenda and not talking and not understanding and not working with local communities, they're not succeeding. Let's put it that way. Okay, but obviously don't quote me on that because this is a very generalized term. The other great thing that I like about this cartoon is when she says, I keep telling him this theory of change is flawed. And what I like about that is it's when I read that, the irony or the sarcasm that I read from it is that the NGO worker or the person who's got this plan to do the change has no idea about the knowledge that already exists in the community. He's underestimating the people that they're working with. So here it's a guy, it's a man and woman, and there's a gender, and there's the whole nother aspect is now gender and working across gender and empowerment. So there's actually tons in this. But just another thing is, for NGOs in terms of the future, if there's a future for NGOs, if NGOs are going to continue to make an impact, there has to be a recognition of the indigenous inherent knowledge that exists in local communities and not an underestimation of the people who you're working with. So just a few things there to think about. But also, yeah, look at the gender. Gender's a great one, and power relations. When we talk about participation and empowerment, I've mentioned it a few times, and I now actually want to focus in on what I'm coming back to is, in terms of going back to the same question now, do NGOs have a future? Have they succeeded or haven't they? And how do we assess this? And this is what I've started this little section on, is the key aspect that we would look at as a development professional, if you may, is the level of participation and empowerment that has come about as a result of the actions of the NGO. And there's this great, we call it a spectrum. You can call it, some people refer to it as a community engagement spectrum, or it's the participation spectrum or empowerment. But basically what it shows different stages of where participation can happen at all these stages, but is true empowerment happening? So some people consider participation to be, well, we've informed them. We had a meeting and we told them what we wanted. So we told them, yes, they participated. That's a very, very low level form of participation. It's like the most basic that there is. It's like when you have a toddler and you inform them, it is bedtime, you are going to bed, there is no discussion, right? There's not even participation from the toddler's side. Always there actually is, but from the parent's perspective, you're just going to inform and they're going to do. Not very, very low engagement. In fact, toddler was probably the worst example I could have given you because they just engaged right back and screamed. So maybe that's a bad example. Anyways, moving up a little bit, there's this, well, we consulted. You can consult with local communities. You can consult with the people who you're working with. You can consult with the country or whatever it is. And that's basically where the main person puts out, or the main organization puts out questions and gets feedback. So the classic baseline survey, the classic tick A, B, C, D, E, people walk around the community with a piece of paper, they ask a few questions, they get their answers, A, B, C, D, E, okay, now we understand the situation, we understand the dynamics. No, you don't. So for example, statistics is a consultative process. Is it bad? No, it's not bad. Is it necessary? Often, but if you stop there, you have a problem. So we consult, we're going to get public feedback. Okay, we want to know what people think. Do we really know what people think at the end of it though? You have to question that. So yeah, they've ticked a few answers, but is that really what they think? And do we know why? We don't know why. Well, the next level that could be good is we involve, working with people, dialogue going back and forth. However, in the top diagram that you see there, the important thing there is that there is still this dominant relationship, this dominant power relationship, where it's me and I'm talking to you guys. When you collaborate, now you start to enable people to talk across you get people to talk across the power relationship. So it's not just about us and them. It actually starts to become about all of us talking together. And the idea in collaboration is that local people or local residents or communities start to have an actual role in the decision-making process. What is going to be done? How are resources going to be used? How are finances going to be split? What are our main ideas? Where are we going? And you start to see an increased level of communication between, you see a decreased role in the original development actor or the NGO or the development practitioner, and you start to see an increase in the collaboration and the role played by local communities. And finally, what is empowerment? Well, empowerment happens where your public, within whatever context it is, the people who it actually affects, the local people, the local community, the public of a country or a province or a town, whatever, they are the ones who are having the most dialogue. The arrows are at the top there, way more than it's coming down to the initial or to the main idea or the development person who started. It's about residents and communities and local people making decisions, coming up with their own solutions and moving on without you. One of the best quotes I ever heard is that as an NGO or a development consultant or practitioner, your ultimate aim is to work yourself out of a job. If communities still need you 10 years down the line, you've missed the boat somewhere. Because essentially what wants to happen is you want to have so much dialogue and participation and engagement happening between the people who actually live there that no one needs you anymore. That's when an NGO is done well. When no one needs them anymore, that's when they've achieved. Needs assessment, empowerment, rural appraisal, mainstreaming. I have no idea what he's talking about. I just want to help, okay? Unfortunately, though, it's not just about helping. Like, there is so much more. There is so much more complexity that has to be dealt with, which is, shown here. Often people who just want to help get stuck at the inform or consult place. And in order to move to the collaboration and the empowerment side of the spectrum, NGOs do need to know about all these concepts and the ways of thinking and changing of thinking. It's not just about rocking up to help. Do I look big in this? Development NGO is the only game in town. Who cares? NGOs are so last season. There's a lot of rhetoric. There's a lot of debate about NGOs. Are they achieving anything? Which goes back to that participation and empowerment. If we look at a lot of development in, and this is obviously a very generalized, in this kind of context where I'm giving you a very broad and general overview, it's difficult to be specific. But if we look at development projects and initiatives in developing world in particular over the last 30 years, there's not a lot of success, to be honest. There's especially on the local level, there's still a lot of challenges. The problems are still there, and so there's a big question of, well, are NGOs last season or not? And it's something you need to think about. I'm not going to give you the answer, basically because I actually don't know, because it's too complicated. But what we do need to do is we need to understand the arguments for and against it. So we need to understand what are the arguments for NGOs continuously being involved, and what are the criticisms about NGOs. So so do I look big in this? So are NGOs the main focus? Are they understand the argument for NGOs as being the most important actor in development? Why do people argue that? And also understand other perspectives where they say, no, NGOs are doing nothing, they're not achieving it. Understand both sides, because when we understand that context and that debate, that's when we can start to make true change. So it's not about saying yes or no, it's about understanding both sides of the arguments. And you'll see it as you read through your module guide, arguments for and against. And then just these last few slides, which you can look at, is I found some really good examples, really good articles. I must say, as a default setting, what's the word I'm looking for? When a disclaimer that the two articles that I found are predominantly based from a northern perspective, which is not my favorite thing. I like to always include a bit of people from the developing countries as well, although I think my last article does have that. Or that might be in my next lecture, not really sure. But anyways, these last few slides are there for you to go through yourselves. You can also follow the links to read the articles themselves, but they're just two great articles that I read about the future of NGOs and how they need to change, or how they don't, or suggestions for how they could change or not. They're articles that raise some of the important debates and controversy that exists within this topic of NGOs and their future. The first one, this one here from this fault line among NGOs, is basically a criticism between NGOs being focused on funding as opposed to being grassroots movements that embrace a radical vision of change, and change on like really where it counts most. And on both sides, you need to understand both sides. On the one side, NGOs can't do anything without funding. So yes, there is a criticism that they've become tied down because they have to do what donors say. They have to fall in line in order to get the money that they need to do what they want to do. And then the other side, so you might understand that. You might understand that is a challenge that NGOs face. But at the same time, they're experiencing criticism because people are saying, but you're not radical grassroots, innovative organization that you used to be. Now you just do whatever the donor says. And I don't have the answers, but it's a real challenge. How do you balance that drive to be grassroots change mechanisms with the need for funding? And the second article that I've put here, The Future of NGOs, it's actually written from a corporate perspective. So CEOs are giving some advice to NGOs on how to do things. And the reason I put this in here is that because a lot of, in the last 5 to 10 years, a lot of the research that's coming out is basically saying, in light of what we saw before, that NGOs have got to find a way to become, if there's a future for NGOs, they have to find a way to become self-funding. Because A, there isn't always enough funding, B, the processes are very complex and very competitive, and C, linking to the article before, if it just becomes about doing what donors want you to do, then is there really a future for NGOs? Then are we not, what is the point? And so one of the responses to that, the funding conundrum, is to say, well, NGOs relook at the way in which you are structured and how you run your organizations, and potentially part of the solution is to actually become financially independent, financially sustainable, and that is a very, very interesting aspect in terms of or concept that is is being written about quite extensively at the moment in terms of the future of NGOs. And so I encourage you to look into that further. So essentially what you want to look for on Google Scholar is you want to look at the future of NGOs, financial sustainability, or self-funded, or something along those lines. You know, a lot of people who work in NGOs would say, you know, we're expecting local communities to become financially independent, but we're not. Or we're expecting a development initiative to become financially sustainable, yet our own NGO is not financially sustainable. So how do we achieve that? And that's why I've added in this article here, which gives some examples. Well, I've taken a few pictures from the article itself just to try and get you a little bit interested, and hopefully you'll take it further and actually go and read it and think about it. I mean, you know, engage in the debate that's up there. And then the last article is just, this is where I also brought in some of the voices from the developing world. It's basically another article, another perspective on the future of transnational advocacy. What we're talking about there in particular is when you have NGOs from developed countries working in developing countries, or even from developed areas working in developing. So moving transnational between different types of countries. And this is another fantastic example. It's got it's a bunch of different specialists who give in their perspective, and it's really interesting. Especially the last section, which talks about you know, digital advocacy, the ways in which the digital world has opened doors for NGOs. So very interesting there. And then the last thing I've done is, because it's COVID-19 and we're living through history is being made in a big way. So as we sit here, I found a few articles that I thought were, and podcasts that I thought were, you know, fairly good and worth listening to or reading. And so I've just added these on the final slide, which you can look further to. Okay, so now clearly I'm losing my words. I'm very thirsty, and I'm going to end this part off now. I'll come back. Our part 2 will be a separate video. But I hope that what I've achieved in the last, I don't know, half an hour or however long it's been, and I really, really hope right now that my computer's been recording. But what I hope to have achieved is to start highlighting the key issues and concepts and debates that are happening in the academic world in terms of talking about NGOs, what they're for, how they're created, how they're structured, the challenges they face, and how we can determine what their future looks like based on whether they've succeeded or not. And I hope that I've created a framework that enables you to understand some of these key tensions and concepts that will enable you to read your module guide and your readings with greater clarity, and better equip you to understand them more comprehensively. Thank you for your time and for watching, and I wish you all the best.